estimated gross development value of £230 million. Unfortunately, it hadn't been given the amount of time which it should have, and consequently there was little due diligence which had been undertaken. And by inheriting this project quite late, it was difficult for me to influence the TfL's development partner. When I first joined, the first thing I did was to review their financial valuations for the project as well as their designs. And through going through the financial valuations, I noticed that there was substantial hard coding errors as well as end property values which seemed quite low to me. So what I did is I used publicly available data to put together this over here, on which I was able to superimpose in red the values which the developer was targeting. And it's important to say that this was specifically for Finchley Central for the units which we went forward. Now, as you can see, the values that the developer was targeting were between Q1 and Q2, far too low for a new residential development project. If anything, one should be aiming for Q3, if not above that. In addition to this, designs utilized very inefficient floor plan over here and incredibly large floor-to-ceiling heights. Now, what this would allow the developer to do was to come following them obtaining planning permission, they could come back with a planning amendment and make their floor plate substantially more efficient and add additional floors in. Now, all this would mean that TfL's land value would be suppressed, which inherently ends the joint venture provisions of the arrangement. And consequently, I worked very hard to try and get the developer to adopt some of these changes early on so TfL could benefit from them. However, they largely resisted, and consequently, whilst it's never great to be the bearer of bad news, I had to inform my employer. Not only because it was ethical to do so, but because I also had a duty to the taxpayer, being the general public. My directors were very supportive of me informing them of what had happened and instructed me to proceed with the project on my own for the time being, whilst they determined the future of the joint venture relationship. So, important to say that when I was given this direction, the first thing I did was I reviewed the critical path of the project as well as the risks. The biggest red flag was grant funding, which is attached to the scheme, came from central government. Specifically, it was the Housing Infrastructure Fund, which from here on out I'll refer to as the HIF grant. So this grant was there to prop up the financial viability of Finchley Central, and it basically delegated £5.7 million for the enabling works of the project. And the drawdown of this fund came with certain conditions, such as milestones that had to be met, profile of cash flow expenditure, as well as a requirement to spend the full grant money by the long stop date, March 2022. An inability to do so would result in repayment penalties, where TfL would have to pay back any money that had been drawn down. Consequently, I appreciated the tight timeline I was operating to, given the March 22 date, and I put together this high-level strategy of how I was going to go about spending the money. And this is what the remainder of my presentation will focus on. So it's important to mention that when I was starting off, I considered how I was going to go appointing the works in a manner which was complementary of the constraints that I was operating to. And the most obvious choice of contract to me was the NEC3, specifically engineering and construction contract, because TfL had previous experience with this contract on projects such as Crossrail. I knew that they were going to be comfortable with it, and its administration was going to be smooth. In addition to this, this contract has a reputation for resolving this quickly and for collaboration. And of course, these were elements that I felt worked really well with the constraints that I was operating with. Now, bearing in mind that I had a very dense amount of information relating to the site, as well as the works which I intended to do, I deemed that considering the risk I had for not meeting the milestones, it was necessary to ensure that the contractor was going to guarantee the works within the appropriate time frame. Consequently, I decided that it was appropriate to ask the contractor to take on the large amount of risk possible under the ECC. And as you can see from this graph over here, that is illustrated through option A, which is effectively a price contract with an activity schedule. So in addition to this main option, I added additional features down here to put together the full contract. The dispute option being in line with the Housing Grant Construction Regeneration Act, as well as some secondary options, which were there to incentivize the contractor to deliver the works within the appropriate time frame. That's delayed damages as well as bonus for early completion. Of course, I also asked for parent company guarantees for the instance that damage was caused to the upper railway. Payment options were in line with the regulation were put forward for dispute options, as well as third-party rights for TfL to be able to step in an instance where it deemed it was necessary to do so. Now, it's important to mention that NEC contracts let under TfL come with a series of fixed Z clauses, which I appreciate can frustrate the NEC. However, through reviewing the TfL-specific Z clauses which were put forward, both on my own and in collaboration with TfL lawyers, I was able to confirm that any clarifications in there were to ensure that there were appropriate definitions of certain activities and that TfL could ensure that it would have back-to-back provisions for further works in the surrounding area. Now, it's important to mention that before going out to tender, I wanted to put together a suitable in which I had a project manager. Of course, it makes sense, that's shown over here in this hierarchy table. And of course, it makes sense to have a project manager involved in the tender process, getting to meet the people who they're likely to be working with. Commercial manager, who is a lot better aware of procurement specifics than myself, as well as the person who's been looking after the supervisor role. Now, this was someone from the TfL action team who had previous experience with an earthworks contractor. It's important to mention that I put this team together not only to ensure that there was a smooth execution of the contract and to complement the gaps of the knowledge that I had. Working with this team and reporting into the director of project management, I assembled contract data part 1, as well as the works and site information. I wanted to ensure that I was putting this information together with a large amount of due diligence, because I wanted to ensure that any tenders I'd be receiving from contractors were reflecting the work which I actually wanted them to do. And I wanted to minimize the opportunity for future compensation events and delays, which would again not fit with the milestones that I had to meet. I also liaised with the